that happened and kind of unfolded during that time period. But it was interesting to me that there are people that still do that. Excellent. Also, there are, it's interesting because, in the Western region, they didn't, law enforcement was kind of a hard thing to come by. They didn't always have police and sheriff available to them in these communities, in these towns, for a variety of reasons, basically because it costs money. And so there was U.S. Marshals that had to come into the area and help sort of police, the citizens in the territories. But they also, it's kind of interesting because they also used bounty hunters. So let's say somebody committed a crime. The citizens would come together with money and they'd pay one particularly tough individual to go hunt this criminal down. So it was bounty hunting was a huge business in the West during the Wild West, in the Old West. And so I wanted to see kind of what that looked like today. And so I tracked down a couple bounty hunters and sort of found out from them, what bounty hunting looks like in 2020, as opposed to like 1880. And so I spoke with Clint Simmons. He was one of the bounty hunters, and Dustin Schindler's another one. And it's funny because these guys use every trick in the book and are just like right on the edge of being sort of illegal, not quite. They don't want to get arrested, but they'll do pretty much anything that they can to catch some of these people. And they get really clever. They wear costumes. They just, they're very, very aggressive about finding people. And they do. They find people regularly. And it's kind of interesting. Clint Simmons has been doing it for about 10 years, bounty hunting. And he's got hundreds of people. And he says that his best trick to find somebody is to go to like an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend and ask them where they're at, because they're happy to sort of share where their former sort of boyfriend or girlfriend is at. But it can also get pretty violent too, which is where they have to be careful. We were talking about U.S. Marshals. I think the most famous gunfight of the Old West was the so-called shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone, where we have sort of the Earps, Wyatt Earp and his brothers, and the Cowboys, which was basically a term for cattle rustlers back then. And they shootout in 1881, and it was considered probably the biggest event of its type of the Wild West. And it was only 30 seconds long, and 30 bullets were fired. And it's interesting because law enforcement was on both sides of the debate. So the good guys weren't always law enforcement, and the bad guys weren't always, the cattle rustlers. Sometimes the law was on both sides. And really what's kind of amazing is not the gunfight that happened, but sort of this vendetta ride that Wyatt Earp went on after the shootout, where he hunted down and killed the men responsible for wounding and killing his brother. And so it's kind of interesting to see kind of after the shootout how those folks ended up going into Colorado and what they did here after the shootout, how Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp were kind of sort of really not allowed back in Arizona for obvious reasons, and how they were trying to avoid being sort of tangled up with the law and being brought back to Arizona. So that was kind of interesting to dig into that whole example. Another famous U.S. Marshal / bounty hunter was Bass Reeves. Bass Reeves was one of the most exciting folks that I came across in my research. I wouldn't say that he's completely forgotten to history, but largely forgotten. And I think maybe he's coming back more sort of into the public eye. But Bass Reeves was an escaped slave who was, he had knocked out his slave owner over a game of cards and escaped to the Oklahoma Territory, where he eventually became a U.S. Marshal. And over the course of 32 years, he captured a staggering 3,000 criminals. I would argue to anybody that Bass Reeves is probably the most prolific of all of the lawmen of the Wild West. And there's a lot of sort of debate today that sort of points in the direction that Bass Reeves may have actually influenced the Lone Ranger. Bass Reeves was well known for going in disguise, and he had sort of like a sidekick, and he was just incredibly deadly and accurate with a firearm. And so there's a lot to be said and a lot of evidence that sort of points in the direction that he may have helped inspire the Lone Ranger, which is pretty amazing. And then sort of, in closing, one of the other interesting things that I did, I did talk to, museum curators. I did a story, a chapter on the Espinozas, who were arguably the first serial killers in the United States, and Tom Tobin, who was the bounty hunter who found and tracked them down and brought back their heads. But I also went to the first bare knuckle boxing heavyweight match sanctioned by a state in like 130 years in Wyoming, and interviewed the people. There were the fighters and the promoters to understand why they would do this and how they got into it. And then went back and did sort of research into the Sullivan-Kilrain fight, which was the last heavyweight boxing, bare knuckle boxing match in history. And kind of how these fighters it was illegal for them to do bare knuckle boxing, but everybody knew that it was going on. But the law was trying to catch them. And so these guys had to sort of sneak in to the fighting area, and avoid the law. And people took trains, which were sort of like secret trains, to the fight location for this incredible fight. And it lasted like 72 rounds, which is unbelievable that these two guys could last for 72 rounds boxing with their bare knuckles. And so that's a really fascinating story that I came across. I also got the chance to do some treasure hunting while I was here, because I think, people came out west looking for their fortunes and for gold and treasure. And sometimes, like the Reynolds gang, these outlaws would rob stagecoaches and take the treasure that they've got, the gold and the money, and they would hide it in the hills. And then they would be captured by the law enforcement of the time, and they'd all be executed or die sort of trying to hold somebody up. So the treasure would be lost. And so there's people today in Colorado and in the West who hunt for gold and for this lost treasure. So it was fun to sort of tag along with them and look for lost treasure. We looked for lost, treasure from bandit catches. We've looked for treasure from, hidden by the Spanish, who were here hundreds of years before the prospectors came out west. So it was really interesting to sort of nail down that history and kind of look into it and kind of get a sense for if it holds up today, if the West is still as wild as it was. Probably not quite as wild as it was. It was pretty wild back then. There was a lot of shootouts, and there was a lot of outlaw activity, bounty hunters. But the West is still pretty wild today. I think if you look in the right places, there are still people who very much embody that spirit of the Wild West. So that kind of concludes my initial sort of presentation. I'm happy to take any questions if you got any.
Lily, Marcus, Colette, any questions? I don't know. Should be able to unmute yourselves if you do have one.
I don't have any questions, but thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. It was.
How are you guys?
It was a lot of fun to research and to go sort of in search of these people to find out who these folks were. The people today that that make giant firearms, or that do bullfighting, or that look for treasure, or compete in fast draw competitions, or who go and hunt for criminals today. It was really fascinating, but really that was eye-opening. But going back into the West and seeing how much of it was real, like were there like shootouts every day in downtown sort of Leadville, Idaho Springs. No, there weren't. Not maybe as many as you see in the movies, but there were a fair amount of shootouts, and some of these the histories of some of these folks, some of these gunslingers, was absolutely incredible, and just kind of amazing to imagine that they survived as long as they did.
So, did Buffalo Bill come through? Because my grandfather used to always talk that he came through the ranch and would water his horses, and he did it more than once. It was out by Briggsdale.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. He was very much a businessman and an entertainer, and I don't know where he found the energy, but I mean, he traveled all over the place. You can see some of the records of the various towns that he went to while he was touring, and there was no town that was too small for him. He went literally everywhere, and he was such sort of an important figure of the Wild West that when he died in 1917, there was kind of a lot of contention and sort of hard feelings between Wyoming and Colorado over where his last remains should be. Cody, Wyoming is a town famously named for him, but he really lived in Nebraska, and he loved Colorado, and his sister lived here, and so there was a lot of debate about where he really had meant to sort of, have his body kind of be put to rest, and it got almost violent a couple times as people from Wyoming gathered together like armaments and headed for the border to steal back his body, and were met with the National Guard on the other side of the border to turn them away. And that happened a couple different times. And even today, they still sort of bring up, maybe in jest, maybe not, but in the Wyoming sort of legislature, they still sort of say, hey, we need to bring Cody back to Cody. This is where he belongs. What do we have to do to make that happen? So it's a debate that probably will never end, but it kind of reflects how important he was as a person, sort of how he kind of represented the West. He really did a fantastic job of being everywhere back then, and sort of really giving people a slice of what it was like back, sort of from the frontier. That's a great question, though. Thank you.
He was chivalrous, right?
Yeah, and in fact, he was very well regarded by the people who worked for him, the Native Americans. You guys have heard of Annie Oakley. She was a very famous sharpshooter from back then. She was with another show entirely, and doing her performances where she would shoot, like with a glass and like look in the mirror and shoot behind her and hit like a cigarette out of her husband's mouth. And she was amazing what she could do, and she saw how well Buffalo Bill treated his people and the animals, especially the horses. And she was so impressed by that she left her show and joined his, which was great because at the time they were on the verge of going, bankrupt. So I think that, a lot could be said about Buffalo Bill's sort of stereotyping maybe what the West was, or maybe stereotyping, the plight of the Native American. But I think at the end of the day, everybody kind of involved with him said that he was a very noble and upstanding guy. So yeah, for sure.
Is there a difference between Golden Glove and the bare knuckle that you were talking about?
Yeah, so Golden Glove is, and I couldn't tell you specifically what the rules are. I know Golden Glove is kind of like a youth-based boxing. So if you go back far enough, you get to what they call Queensberry rules, and you get back even further where boxing was just bare knuckle. There was nothing on your hand at all, really. When I told you guys about the Kilrain-Sullivan fight, at the end of that fight, one of the fighters had several broken fingers on his hand, and he was still punching. So it was pretty brutal stuff. Golden Glove is much more sort of contemporary modern, where they wear like the 10-gallon gloves, which provide a lot of cushion. When they brought back bare knuckle boxing recently, just in like the last year, they wrapped the hand very like just like some cloth. There's basically nothing on it. and it's pretty brutal stuff. It's similar to like the MMA, like UFC sort of fighting, but just a little bit meaner because it's bare knuckle. But a very interesting type of combat sport. But good question, thank you.
My question was about something that I don't know if you did any research on. My interest is in square dance and traditional dance forms. So I was just curious if that was something that you had looked into at all, either in this book or anything else.
Yeah, no is the short answer, but so I didn't. I really kind of stuck with kind of the wild. I mean, certainly square dancing can get pretty wild.
It could. It could.
My only as a journalist and as a writer, I did a story once for a newspaper about square dancing, and they pulled me into it. So I had to square dance with everybody. I couldn't just write and take photos. They pulled me into it. So that was,
you did sort of the modern Western square dance thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Different ball of wax.
Yeah. But that was interesting. But no, I mean, as far as like, as a means of entertainment in the West, I mean, having sort of those communal gatherings in the Old West was super important for community. And so I know that there's like a whole huge and really interesting history behind it, but I'm not familiar with that particular. But yeah, thank you for asking. It is interesting stuff, though.
Yeah.
You want to ask him about how he became an author? I mean, those things got him interested. But go ahead, ask him. Lily, you want to ask him about?
Marcus is one of our kids who comes to our writing workshops.
Oh, cool.
So he's
nice.
He's a mystery guy. He likes mysteries.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I'm. Are you familiar with C.J. Box?
Mommy has read them all.
She has. She is.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I had the chance to meet with and interview C.J. Box a couple times while working for Cowboys and Indians magazine, and C.J. Box was really nice and is providing a quote for the cover of the second edition of Spurred West, which is really kind of him. He's a really, really nice guy. But that's the extent of my mystery background. But yeah, C.J. Box is a really fantastic writer. If you ever get the chance, he's quite good. And I know you said you had read like all of his books. It's easy to sort of burn through all of them because they're super addictive.
Yeah, you can't put them down once you start.
Yeah.
And Grandma knows them all too, huh? We keep Grandma stocked.
So
she's in Wyoming.
Yep.
Have you ever gotten in a sketchy place where when you were doing interviews, I've met a few people that came down from the hills that were gold miners, and they were scary.
Yeah. I dealt with a lot of gold miners in my first book, where I kind of went into these gold mining areas and talked to these folks. And I'd say for the most part, they're very passionate people. They're very, they're in their own way. They've sort of embraced the Wild West, I think it's fair to say. I have been in sketchy places, not so much with these books, because I had the chance to sort of find people, I think if I had gone and hung out more with, the bounty hunters, I'm sure that it could have gotten kind of sketchy. I went backcountry hiking, pretty deep in the backcountry looking for lost sort of Spanish gold or signs pointing towards lost Spanish gold. That was spooky because there was lots of like bear activity in the area. So I don't know if that counts or not, but yeah, I mean, I think thankfully, in this day and age, it's a little less sketchy than maybe it was, originally. You go back into the records and you sort of start digging around and find, the coroner inquest forms for some of these, shootouts, and you're like, wow. I mean, that was a sketchy time period, where you really did have to carry a firearm with you. A lot of people don't know about the Espinozas, But right after the gold was kind of first discovered here in 1859, the Civil War kicked off. And so a lot of people went running back east. And there were a few folks that stayed out here and kept mining and prospecting and, doing timber and logging and things like that. But these bodies started showing up and nobody knew who was killing them. And so that's one of the stories that I kind of talk about in Spurred West is sort of the story of the Espinozas and kind of why they were doing what they were doing and why, they may be considered, America's first serial killers. So that definitely would have been a very, very spooky time to live in the West because, you don't really have law enforcement as we have it today. And there's no CSI running around. There's no FBI running around. Really the U.S. Marshals really weren't involved at that time. And so what do? Like if you have somebody running around killing people, you're sort of left with very few options. You go to the military and they've got their hands full, so you go to a bounty hunter and you hope you find the meanest, baddest guy or gal around who can find this person, track them, and bring them back. And so that would have been a very spooky time, I think, to be in the West. Great question, though.
I had a question about how you see sort of the relationship between Buntline and his arguably more respected counterpart, Samuel Clemens.
Well, I think that Mark Twain was a really good writer for one, and a satirist, and a little bit sort of above maybe where Ned Buntline was at. Ned Buntline was happy to sort of appeal to the masses. I think he embraced it. He really loved the idea of a great story, and he wouldn't let the truth get in the way of that. And I think that Mark Twain was happy. I'm certainly not a Mark Twain scholar by any means, but he was happy to poke fun at himself. He was happy to poke fun at his audience. It didn't really matter to him because he was kind of a satirist in a lot of ways. And I would say that Ned Buntline probably took himself too seriously to be, sort of to take that road. And if you read some of Buntline's stuff, it reads as kind of like pulpy in a way, kind of has a pulp feel to it. And I think that Mark Twain, was sort of taking a higher sort of road in a lot of respects, certainly from, an academic one in his writing. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
I guess so. Yeah, I was curious because I've heard sort of the same kind of comments about Samuel Clemens and Mark Twain, that he, wouldn't let the truth get in the way of a good story, and that was why he got out of newspapers, was because he just couldn't manage to tell the truth.
Yeah, and I think in an American sort of newspapers, I think that kind of was more prevalent. The whole concept of yellow journalism, or kind of like that super exaggerated, ridiculous degree journalism, newspapers, didn't really end until kind of after the 1900s. So it was a problem, for sure. And as a researcher, if you're, say, trying to write about the shootout at the OK Corral, multiple newspapers wrote about that at about the same time. And some newspapers were for, the Earps, and some were against them, depending on kind of where their loyalties fell. So I think when doing research back then, you had to read as many sources as you can to get a sort of a more complete picture of what was happening. And if everybody's sort of saying the exact same thing, it's a fairly good bet that that's, as close to the truth as we can get for that time. But that's a terrific question.
I'm going to ask him what influenced him, like when did he start writing? Okay, so we have the budding writers here.
Cool.
When did you really start writing? Did you write journals? Did you write little stories when Like, were you young and you were having these ideas, or were you learning history and you were just fascinated and couldn't get enough?
Yeah, I think all of the above. So when I was young, I wrote as much as possible, and it was fiction, because I think when you're that young, you can't really write, sort of compelling nonfiction unless it's like a journal or something. But I kind of got into journalism because I enjoyed writing, and I like to write a lot, and I love to read. But it's hard to sort of find a paying job in writing today. There's lots of people go to college and get degrees in English, and then they end up working at, Best Buy. So it's hard to find jobs that pay writers. And journalism was one way for me. So I kind of got into it, and then I started finding out how to tell a compelling and interesting story using sort of the techniques of fiction, sort of making it compelling, making it interesting, making it intense and scary, like you would when writing fiction, but doing it using nonfiction. So I think you can use a lot of the same tools. So I guess my advice to anybody who's interested in sort of pursuing a career in writing is to write a lot and read even more. Because I think Neil Gaiman said it best. He said that writers can't exist in an echo chamber. So if you want to be a good writer, you have to sort of read everybody and everything, even things you don't like, preferably things that are well written. And that's a great bit of advice that he had that I would definitely stand by. But I'm happy to answer any questions about writing or publishing if you have any additional ones.
So how long did it actually take you to get this book published after you finished the manuscript?
So unlike fiction, so in the case of fiction, you have to write your book first, and then you kind of shop it around to agents or publishers. In the case of nonfiction, generally you have a proposal. So you've got a few sample chapters, you've got kind of like a business plan saying, hey, this is what it'll look like. Here's a sample of my writing. Here's my resume. In my case, I was a newspaper editor for like 10 years. I won all these awards. Here's the story that I'd like to tell. Here's kind of like how I would break down the chapters, and you kind of send that to them. And so they kind of evaluate it, and they can sort of give you the green light or not. And so in my case, when I got the green light, my publisher gave me a year to sort of make good on it. So I had basically a year to sort of do the research, do the writing, do the interviews. And so it was a very crazy year. And so you have that deadline, and you have to finish it by that certain date. And that's kind of how my second book worked as well. I'd already written Gold for them, and they were very happy with it. So I had proposed Spurred West, and kind of did the same thing where I was like, hey, look, here's some characters, and here's some people I'm thinking about interviewing, and they kind of already know my writing style. And so that's how that one kind of got, the approval.
Interesting.
I think I don't have any more questions.
How about you, Lily?
No,
You want to ask him anything?
no.
If you were going to tell somebody to read one and only one chapter from Spurred West, which section would it be? I know that's a horrible question to put on someone, but
I guess it depends on what you're looking for from the book if you're going to read one chapter. So if you want a sense for kind of like the writing style and kind of what I cover in the book, the introduction is probably a good place. One of the most exciting chapters in the book is the one on treasure hunters, because I talk about the Reynolds gang and kind of how they were stealing money for the Confederacy, supposedly during the Civil War, and how they had to hide their treasure, and how they were hunted down and killed in various terrible ways, and then how there are people today looking for their treasure, and how there's other sort of treasures in gold still kind of hidden out there in the West, and what those look like. So that's kind of a fun one. So the introduction, if you just want to get like a sense for what the book's about, but The one on treasure hunters is a fun one to sort of dig into.
Who
Never
was,
been asked that question before, but that's a good one.
who was the person that killed the Espinoza brothers?
His name was Tom Tobin, and he was a scout for the U.S. Army. He knew Buffalo Bill Cody, as it turns out, and Wild Bill Hickok. They were all kind of knew each other because they were all scouts for the Army at the time. And Tom Tobin was sort of living in the San Luis Valley area, and he was trying to start a farm or a ranch, and the Army had an outpost nearby, and the commander knew Tom Tobin and knew that he was exceptionally deadly and very good at tracking people down. And so the Espinozas, one of them had been killed by a posse that had come across them. There was a gunfight. But the other Espinoza escaped, and he recruited one of his cousins to continue sort of this killing spree. And Tom Tobin found them in like 2 days, and it took other people weeks. So he was very, very, very good at finding people. Yeah, pretty grisly stuff, but interesting and an important part of Colorado history.
If anybody else has any other questions, that'd be great. Oh, Colette, do you have any questions?
Well, I was just going to thank you for sharing your time with us. I haven't read the books yet, so I can't even formulate questions, but I'm excited to go get a copy and read it. And thank you for sharing your evening with us.
Absolutely, yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, I hope you enjoy it. I think that our history is pretty wild and exciting, and really, frankly, I think that's what history should be. So much is like, the westward expansion of the European settler, Volume 2, and it's just boring and horrible. And frankly, history is kind of like it is today. It's exciting and colorful and crazy and sort of unpredictable and sometimes funny and terrifying. And as a writer, if you can if you can portray that in some way, then you're doing a pretty good job. And so it made it easy for me because the West is a pretty wild and interesting place. But thank you.
You bet.
Colette is an author as well as an artist, an amazing artist, by the way. I'm probably embarrassing her, and I'm so sorry, but I know you're very gifted and talented.
Nice. Excellent.
Her watercolors are beautiful. Right. And so I haven't seen any of your sculpture. I'm so sorry.
All right. Well, I am going to, I think, wrap this up. We do have another author talk coming up next week. Yes, next week on the 8th. So I hope folks can join us for that. But Ian, this has been an absolute pleasure, and I had a great time. And thanks for coming and doing this. This was
absolutely.
Fantastic.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and thank you all for coming and listening to me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for your time. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, folks.
Bye.
So let me stop the recording.